Welcome, colleagues, to another workshop for local authority colleagues. This one's around the high needs place review process. Andy Humphries, I work in the data management and collections unit of the funding directorate in ESFA. Aim of this process is so that ESFA funded institutions can receive the correct place funding directly from ESFA, and ESFA can also then deduct from local authorities' dedicated schools grant that same number of places at a rate appropriate for the provider type. So for a special school, an AP provision, that would be at £10,000 per place. And for mainstream academies with a high needs unit, that would be £6,000 for each occupied place and £10,000 for each unoccupied place. I shall cover the template and what that looks like in a little while, but rest assured it doesn't look that different from what it has in previous years. But we would expect that local authorities ensure that the place numbers that you are providing in this template reflect the agreed commissioning activity and the strategic planning with those institutions. So it's not a we think they may get in the future or across the whole year. It is what has been an agreed commissioning amount. And if there is then change in that commissioning amount, then you have the top up arrangements to flex that as required. We'd expect that you've consulted with your institutions in scope of the process. So remember that not all providers are in scope for this process. We don't expect you to be informing us of changes to maintain school place numbers. That's a situation that you would handle locally. And you would be including funded places agreed and commissioned by other local authorities, because the import-export process will then handle that subsequently. So you are informing us of the agreed place numbers up front, and then there will be an import-export correction as required once we are aware of the parent LA that has a child within those places. Hospital education funding is covered in this situation as well, in this activity as well. And as the slide says, this is to reflect a permanent change in medical provision. And although it doesn't affect a huge number of local authorities, we will need NHS evidence of a date of change and a change in the number of beds at that provider. Institutions who are in scope for that exercise. Mainstream academies and mainstream free schools, of course, they must have a unit that supports high needs provision. Studio schools and UTCs, similarly, with a unit. Special academies and special free schools are in scope. Alternative provision academies are in scope, as are FE colleges and the independent learning providers as well. We will give you a list of all the providers that we are aware of who are in scope for the exercise. You may add more, but we would only account for those changes where the provider is one of those provider types. So if you try and add a mainstream maintained school, then it's unlikely that that is going to be accepted unless that school subsequently becomes an academy. Okay. In addition, SPIs that require and meet the initial eligibility criteria for receiving place funding from ESFA, but are not funded by ESFA in 21-22. So there is additional places to be funded by us going forward. So they can be included as well. I mentioned where the cases are agreed. You can indicate where a change in places is requested by yourselves, but has not yet been agreed by the local authority and the institution together. So if you have not reached an agreement on the change in place numbers, you can submit that new number, but you must clearly mark that you have not had that agreed with the institution. Where those numbers are not agreed, the ESFA will determine the number of places that we will fund. And that is a process that we set out in the technical note for this process, and those outcomes will then be published in late January. There is a 2-week window from that publication point that local authorities and institutions may advise that those numbers have subsequently been agreed. So if they've subsequently been agreed, that's fine. We can make a change to the place numbers that we've published as the outcome. So we do understand that that there may be some of the fine print hasn't quite been agreed by the 12th of November. So you can put the intended place number in. If it's not been agreed, then we will follow the process as outlined in the technical note. But if you then say during the inquiry window, look, we've now come to agreement, and the institution is copied into that notification so that they can see that it has now been agreed, then we can reflect that agreement. We may also consider exceptional cases where the numbers are still not agreed, but there is a significant change in funded places. So it may be that there is agreement for a significant increase in places. The agreement has not got to the point where the exact number is known between the authority and the institution, but it is significantly higher than the previous situation. Then, clearly we can make agreements at that point on a number while discussions then continue. Okay, so the inquiry window does allow for some changes to be made, but only to where those providers had place number changes requested in the first place. It's not an extension of the process. So we will make available via the data collections portal in early October an LA specific place review template. Okay, we'll issue further details on the 5th of October. And if you haven't received something by that point, then please do make contact with us and we'll let you know who we sent it to. We'll use existing contacts that we have. So do get in touch via that mailbox if you've recently taken over responsibility for this area of work, or a colleague has now left and there is a risk that we might send that email to your former colleague, because we don't want you to be waiting around for an email that hasn't arrived. So if you haven't heard from us, then please do let us know and we'll make sure that we get that over to you. As I've said, we need these responses in by the 12th of November. And the 2-week inquiry window will open in late January, which gives us the outcomes. Obviously, where place numbers are agreed by both yourselves and the institution, then it's pretty likely that that number will be reflected in that inquiry window. Full details are in the high needs funding arrangements for 2022-23 are now online. If nothing else, you could probably just put that wording into Google and it'll come up pretty much at the top of the list. That is a copy of the workbook tab with data in it. This is a dummy table, but it will show all of the providers and their current place numbers that are in scope for a place change. It is for information only. That isn't the data set you change. You won't be able to change it because the sheet will be protected, but it does show the providers, their current position in terms of funded place numbers and what providers that you are able to change if you so wish. The second sheet is split into 2 sections, and this is the area that you can make changes to. The first section is for where you are putting high needs places into an institution, either because it's a brand new institution or it is an institution that was not on the list of those in scope. So it may be an institution that is already in existence but hasn't had high needs place funding in 21-22. That first area is that you will tell us the reason for the change. So is it a new unit or for some other reason? And then as you make choices in the columns, then other columns will become open to you. They won't be grayed out. A key column that we've added this year is mention of a deed of variation. Now, ESFA has a funding agreement with every academy, and the funding agreement must make mention of high needs provision being available at that academy or studio school or UTC, etc. Okay, now that's not to say that children with an EHC plan cannot attend the school and that they cannot receive funding directly from you. But what it does mean is that they cannot receive funding directly from us as the ESFA. So we will need acknowledgement that a deed of variation to their funding agreement is in place so that those places can then be commissioned within a unit. Okay, now many of them may have an existing clause that references a high needs unit because they've used standard clauses, and even though it hasn't been relevant before, it is there ready and waiting for in case it was ready, or perhaps they had a unit in the past that temporarily closed and now is reopening, and so they have the clause already there. But if a provider is brand new to high needs provision and a unit is being set up and therefore is in scope for this, then a funding agreement must be in place, and that notification clicked as yes for us to accept those places. Okay, as I say, it doesn't mean that you cannot fund them for high needs places directly, but it means we cannot provide the funding directly from ESFA. Okay, so the money would not be deducted from your DSG, and you would continue to fund the academy directly. So you would then continue on and add in the place numbers as you are requiring for the new institution. The second section just below that, which is the change from current high needs places. And those are where you are making changes either up or down to a provider that was listed in this original list of providers already in scope that I showed on the previous slide. Okay, so that bottom section, it's much bigger because it's more likely that you're going to be amending existing provision than you are adding new institutions. But again, the column for the deed of variation is relevant where there is a structural change. So if, for example, you have a secondary or an all-through provider that is now going to be expanding the age range of the unit into post-16, but the age range in the funding agreement only goes up to 16, then they need a DOV to expand their age range. Okay, we are not able to fund high needs monies for a post-16 place if the school is a 11 to 16 or a 3 to 16 provider in their funding agreement. Okay, as I say, it's not to say that you can't fund it directly, but it means that we wouldn't accept this place request, wouldn't deduct from your DSG, and so would then expect you to fund the place directly. I wanted to draw your attention to that bit because that's the main structural change to the workbook, to be perfectly honest, that we need that extra reassurance that the DOV is in place. It is the trust's responsibility to submit the DOV. It is their funding agreement with us. They would need to make sure that it is in place. And if it isn't, then as I say, the funding would remain with you and you can fund them directly. And this is a text version of what I've just shown you. It is in two sections. New providers and other notifications is in section 1, and then which is a relatively small section. It might have about 15 rows in it. But then the second section is where you can make changes to providers already with high needs place funding from ESFA. And again, the additional column regarding the deed of variation. If it's not with the ESFA by mid-December, then we won't reflect those the places requiring that clause. So if you asked for an extra 10 pre-16 places and 2 post-16 places for a school that was 11 to 16, and the DOV is not in place, the additional pre-16 places would be accepted, but not the new post-16 ones if the DOV wasn't in place. So it doesn't reject the whole request. It will reject part of the request where the funding agreement does not cover it. Okay, so it's not a whole thing if there is a pre-16 unit clause already in place. Hospital education element. The first thing you must do if you have a hospital education provision and wish to update any of that information, the first thing you must do is click the confirm funding tick box at the front, at the top of that sheet. Then the rest of the sheet will appear and you can complete information as required. Okay, if you want to update it, you must click that tick box. Otherwise, the rest of the form does not open. Okay, for hospital education. There is a link in the information that appears once you click that box that will give you a link to the funding guidance for hospital education and the changes that are needed there as required and how to do that. sheet that we added last year, and there was a sheet similar to it the year before, was born from the success it had in the Authority Pro Forma tool that many of you will be aware of, the APT, in that we're aware that these forms can be difficult to fill in. So what we try to do is to give you some helpful advice and tips where the form isn't quite completed correctly, and therefore you can correct the issue before you submit it. It means that then if there is a red flag on that validation worksheet at the end, we will send it back to you to correct. So if you can correct it before you submit, then that's going to save some turnaround time for us, and it will save some turnaround time for yourself as well. With the APT, if there is an issue, it will flag up as a fail, as you can see on the right-hand side, but it will also show at school level if there's a school level reason for the problem. And that, for example, has the change been agreed? It will tell you if there is a problem with that column and which school that problem is with. So you may not have put it yes or no into that row. And if you hover over that title column, there will be a comment that will appear that will help you to resolve the issue. Okay, so we try as best as we can to help you find out where there is a validation issue and point you in the direction of resolving it before you submit. If you are having trouble to resolve the validation issues, then do please contact the Hines mailbox. We're hopeful that the text prompts in here will help you resolve those fairly straightforwardly. They're not difficult resolution. It may be that you've put some numbers into an area that is not permitted given that provider type. So it may just be a very simple data entry error. But again, just to remember the new requirement regarding the deed of variation as well for any providers where you're implementing a structural change, whether that's for the first time or extending, for example, the age range. One other thing to remind you about, which is outside of this process, but it is a useful one to remember because it is linked in to this area, where schools have been in the maintained sector but are converting to become an academy, that is a point whereby you can change the number of high needs places that the academy is funded for, because you can't change those places in this process. A maintained school is not in scope. So if a school has become an academy and there has been a significant change in the number of places that school has had, then you can let us know to ensure that the payments to the new academy and the DSG deductions from your funding reflect the latest picture. The department's project lead, who's working with the school to become an academy, will have access to that form, and it would need to be countersigned by the Chief Financial Officer at the LA, and when submitted, copied to the converting school when it's copied back to the project lead, so everybody can see that that form has been filled in, and then we will look to amend payments to the academy as quickly as we can, and of course the DSG deduction will be adjusted to reflect that new place number distribution. Without that form, we will simply use the latest Section 251 returns to allocate place funding for the new academy. So if they aren't any different from that number, if the school has been on a steady state in terms of the size of its unit, then no problem. But if you have been funding it differently from the most recent S251 return, then please do let us know via that form, and then we can make sure that the academy is funded and you are deducted the correct amounts.
Hospital education, for a bit of clarity, because I think there might have been a bit of confusion last year. If there are hospital education places that are funded in an academy, they should be put through the place change worksheet, and that's both places or the per place funding amount. And they would be changed, so the allocation to the academy is amended that way. the hospital education funding part of it relates to actually as a local authority, your dedicated schools grant funding. That's where there's a permanent change due to medical need. So that won't impact on the academies. That should be done through the high needs place change form. Because you will get sort of each year, this year there's an 8% sort of increase to the hospital education factor. If you want to pass that on to the academies, here's where to do it so that the academies get that change. The other bit is where there's been the change in medical need.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for your time and for attending this session. I hope you found it useful.